Opposition MPs continue to demand answers from the federal government after Vice-Admiral Mark Norman's 2-year ordeal concluded yesterday with the words, "You're free to go." Prosecutors stayed the breach of trust charge against the military's former second-in-command, saying they received new information from his legal defense team back in March. First, here's a reminder of where this political and legal story all began. The Harper government awarded a $700 million contract to Quebec's Davie shipyard to convert a commercial ship into a Navy supply ship. It was an unprecedented deal because the feds changed the rules so they could award the contract without any competition. But Davie's competitors had their own proposals they wanted to pitch. So in November 2015, the new Liberal government quietly agreed to pause and review the deal. Information was leaked to James Cudmore, then a reporter at CBC News, that the contract was on ice. The feds backtracked and quickly approved the contract, but furious over the leak, they ordered the RCMP to investigate. Enter Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, the military's second-in-command. The RCMP alleged that for over a year, he leaked cabinet secrets to unauthorized parties, including Davie, to help the shipyard secure the contract. In January 2017, Norman was suspended from his job. And more than a year later, he was charged with 1 count of breach of trust. Norman's trial was scheduled for August on the eve of the federal election. In pretrial hearings, Norman's lawyers argued the case was politically motivated and fought for months to access various government documents to prove it. Then, Liberal MP and former Canadian Forces Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie announced he wouldn't run for re-election, and reports surfaced that he would testify in the trial for the defense. A few days later, prosecutors announced they were staying the charge against Norman. The prosecution said that yesterday because new information, they claim, came to light that meant there was no longer a reasonable chance of conviction. And CBC News has learned at least some of that information came from former Conservative cabinet ministers. How did this charge happen then in the first place, and what should the next course of action be? Arif Virani is Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Michael Barrett is an Ontario Conservative MP. And Daniel Blakey is the NDP's Treasury Board critic. All three of them join us from the foyer of the House of Commons. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Virani, I'll start with you. Opposition parties are calling for further investigations into how the Norman case was allowed to get as far as it did when information that led to the prosecutors abandoning the charges was out there. Namely, I'm talking about what former Conservative ministers were saying, but it wasn't tracked down by the RCMP. Is the government concerned about the nature of the RCMP's investigation?
We have a tremendous amount of confidence in the RCMP as a general proposition and also in the RCMP's handling of this case. What's important for your viewers to understand is that the RCMP conducted that investigation. The DPP makes a decision to lay a charge, and then the Director of Public Prosecution made a decision to stay the charge. What's important is that there was never any involvement by any political officials of any kind at any of those steps along the way, and that was actually reaffirmed yesterday by the Director of Public Prosecutions, who went at length to say just exactly that in a press release.
Well, actually, the DPP specifically said political interference, though Marie Henin, the lawyer for the defense, was talking about political involvement. She also said there was no political interference in the decision to lay the charge or withdraw it. What I'm asking, though, is just on the face of it, of hearing that all this information existed out there, but wasn't even, no former Conservative cabinet minister was even requested to be interviewed by the RCMP. Is there not some concern just on the face of it from your government about the conduct of this investigation, given the fact that Mr. Norman endured 2 years, of waiting for what happened yesterday?
What I will say is what I've said before, is that we have a lot of confidence in the RCMP, in their leadership, in initiatives they've taken in other regards under Brenda Lucky's stewardship in terms of addressing things like gender equality within the forces, etc. Obviously, decisions were made about laying a charge, and as information comes to light, what people need to understand is that I, as a lawyer, many lawyers that are out there, when things start to unfold, when trials proceed, pretrial applications are made, different decisions are made during the course of litigation. A decision was made during the course of this litigation yesterday that, based on what had been disclosed by new information that had come to light, a decision was made that a reasonable prospect of conviction was no longer there. The prosecutor then independently made the correct decision to no longer proceed with the charge. That's the way this system is supposed to work, and that's the way it did work yesterday.
It's interesting, though, that information would not have come to light earlier, given what it did to change the case.
And again, what I can say to you is that the RCMP does very thorough investigations. I think a lot of what we've heard thus far, I appreciate your question, but a lot of what we've heard thus far is that somehow even the investigation was politically charged or politically influenced. That is exactly what did not happen in this case. I'm at pains to answer you because I don't have the direct answers, Vashti, because political individuals such as myself or cabinet ministers or the Prime Minister were not involved in the original RCMP determination.
Right, I take your point, but I mean the claim is coming from Mr. Norman himself, who said that, and I don't want to quote him specifically, but basically laid out the idea that there was an inherent bias in the government and perhaps otherwise against him, and that led to a lot of this. But I want to move on to Mr. Barrett. My colleague Murray Brewster reported last night that it was very likely that new information came from former Conservative cabinet ministers or staff what led the prosecutors to stay the charges. Why was that information not volunteered earlier to the RCMP by those former ministers?
Well, very early on in the process, when Vice-Admiral Norman was trying to defend himself against, what were suspect motivations that led to these charges being laid. We had over 70 people in a room, and only one of them was pursued for investigation, and the Prime Minister announcing he would face trial before charges were laid. And during the process, when the Vice Admiral was seeking to defend himself, he was looking for the disclosure of documents. The Liberals said that the holdup was that the Conservatives wouldn't release the documents that were covered by cabinet confidentiality from when we were in government. And the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, promptly responded that with a blanket waiver of all cabinet confidences relating to this issue. And so that the availability of that information has been there for the government, for the Liberal government, for the duration of this process. But when they're taking over 6 months to respond to simple requests for information, and they're using more carbon to redact these documents than in the Prime Minister's carbon footprint, it's hard to believe that they want to pin this on Stephen Harper and his ministers. Why Vice-Admiral Mark Norman had his life dragged through the mud for 2 years simply because he didn't line up just right the way the Prime Minister wanted him to.
What about the conduct of the RCMP, though? Because it's a little bit separate. The issues are a bit separate. I take your point around the questions around withholding those documents for 6 months, as Ms. Hennon pointed out yesterday. But when it comes to the RCMP not asking, for example, or it appears that's what Aaron O'Toole said earlier, that he hadn't been asked. Jason Kenney said it as well, that they weren't asked to be interviewed, essentially, until they spoke to Marie Hennon in March, and then that information was presented to the Crown. What kind of remedy is there for that? Should there be an investigation into the RCMP's conduct here?
Well, we don't have all of the answers, surrounding this situation. The Prime Minister was missing in action today for Prime Minister's question period. We're looking for all of the details that are available surrounding this case, and just like Vice-Admiral Norman faced, we're facing a lack of disclosure and transparency from this government again.
But what about the RCMP? I'm asking about the RCMP separate from what you're talking about, the political implications of this.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to, review the information that we have. It's still very new, and we haven't got the answers as to how this came about with the RCMP's process. And then we'll use the tools that are available to us to further the course of justice.
Mr. Blakey, your colleague Tracy Ramsey wrote to the Director of Public Prosecutions today, asking her to investigate whether there was political interference in the case. But in a statement yesterday, Kathleen Roussel, who is the Director of Public Prosecution, said there was no outside or political influence. So essentially here, are you asking her to investigate her own office?
Well, I think what we're asking is to try and get away from the idea that the Liberal government is going to be the one to pronounce on whether or not this was handled appropriately by the government itself. It's something that we saw in the SNC case too, where we're being asked again today in the House to just take the government at its word that nothing inappropriate happened. We are looking, and the NDP continues to search for some kind of avenue to get an independent investigation of some kind so that Canadians can look to an expert who has had all the facts that they need made available to them to let Canadians know whether or not this government, which seems to have a pattern, frankly, of putting political clouds over criminal proceedings, Whether or not that's something that they're really doing, or whether or not these processes are rolling out in the independent way they say they are.
Kind of proclaiming, though, that they already have, right? I mean, the opposition has said, you're saying that there's political interference here, but then you're saying an investigation is also needed. Have you already presumed the outcome of that?
No. What we're saying is that there's enough evidence out there to be concerned and to think that there may have been interference. What we're saying is that the word of the government on this is not enough. It's just not enough. So for them to say, well, take our word for it, it hasn't happened, but yeah, we don't want anybody who actually knows what they're talking about to look at the evidence and to have an independent investigation of this, just doesn't do it. And so we're looking for avenues. We tried a number of different ways on the SNC file in order to have some kind of independent investigation. We're seeing a similar kind of phenomenon here, and we're looking for ways that we can get somebody who's an expert to have access to the right information and to pronounce in a credible way for Canadians on whether or not this government is interfering in criminal proceedings or not. And we're not there yet.
Mr. Varani, does Mr. Blakey have a point? If your government has nothing to hide about its conduct in all of this, why not be open to an investigation so Canadians can be assured of the same conclusion?
We don't have anything to hide. You're absolutely right. And what I think needs to be underscored for all of your viewers is that these allegations are simply that. And what they're doing is actually alleging about senior civil servant officials who serve this country extremely well and extremely nobly, such as senior members of the RCMP and the Director of Public Prosecutions. And Mr. Blakey doesn't need to take my word for it. You mentioned Marie Heenan. What she said is that the DPP's decision was, quote, unimpacted by any political considerations, as it should be.
She also said that officials in the
are supposed to work.
Mr. Varani, with respect, she also said officials in the PCO and PMO were counseling witnesses as to what they could and couldn't say.
Yeah, they were gerrymandering the process.
What I would say in respect of that, Vashi, and in respect of what Mr. Barrett said earlier, is that he's a member of the Justice Committee and he should understand how this process actually unfolds. In terms of compliance with court orders, we've always complied with the court orders. Did it take a long time to produce the documents? Absolutely, because there were 8,000 that were identified across 7 different government departments. And just so your viewers understand...
No, but to be fair, you could have waived cabinet confidence initially, produced everything at the earliest possible convenience, and as Ms. Hennon pointed out yesterday, or you could have litigated. And what the government chose to do, at Mr. Wernick's decision actually, was to litigate.
And what you should know, and what all of your viewers should know, is that the way these sorts of processes unfold is that we identify the documents and they go to the Privy Council office and they assert cabinet confidence and solicitor-client privilege. So all of these redactions, this blacking out, this cover-up, as Mr. Barrett likes to call it, is not done by a political master. It's done by a civil servant who's attempting to protect very important confidences that
I didn't call it a cover-up, but it is a cover-up. And throughout this process, they were using code words. They're very well experienced at obstructing and interfering, and to have that kind of foresight to know to swap out words so that they're not going to be subjected to the ATIPs is unbelievable. So if that's not a cover-up, I really don't know what is. And what they've done is cast the public servants that they proclaim to defend in a negative light. You know what? The Conservative government implemented the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and it's solely for that reason, and solely because of the foresight of the Conservative government that we don't have a situation.
Let him finish, and then we'll keep you. Don't worry.
That we have a situation here where, had we not done that, then they would change the outcome of criminal proceedings, like we saw.
So you do believe, though, the DPP made her decision free from political interference? Mr. Barrett, I'm asking Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, do I believe that the DPP made her? Yeah, so I believe that in spite of the Liberals' best efforts, that the Director of Public Prosecutions made her decision free from political interference. But just because the Liberals failed to interfere doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong.
Okay,
Mr. Blakey,
this is what makes this
really quickly,
very
Mr. Varani,
conducive in terms of this analysis. Take it from the judge's mouth. The judge yesterday complimented the Department of Justice officials and the DPP for all of their work in ensuring this process ran its due course and was appropriately.
The judge also reamed the government lawyers out many times during the trial, to be fair. Mr. Blakey, final word to you. You said you're looking for a remedy here. Would that include something similar to what, to be fair, happened with SNC, where people were called before the Justice Committee? Is that something that your party's looking at proposing?
Well, I mean, frankly, we were glad for some of the testimony that happened at the Justice Committee. In the absence of a public inquiry, it was one way to get some things on the record, but that was never the gold standard. The gold standard would be some kind of independent investigation with somebody credible who can have real findings, because the Justice Committee never had any findings on the SNC-Lavalin affair that can be shared publicly with Canadians so that they can have an assessment of whether or not this government has been playing politics with criminal prosecutions in Canada. It's a serious charge, and they should not not be the ones to be judge and jury on whether or not they acted appropriately. It's not right. We're seeing a similar kind of thing down south in terms of a debate about whether it's appropriate for the president and his hand-picked attorney general to pronounce on their guilt or innocence with respect to a similar kind of issue. It doesn't pass muster there. It shouldn't pass muster here. What we need is credible findings by somebody who's had access to all the information. I'm not that person. Mr. Varani's not that person. Nobody in cabinet is that person because they're not independent. So what we need is a retired judge or somebody else to get access to that information, do a proper investigation, and release the findings to Canadians. Until we get there, we're going to continue to have this pall cast over the Canadian judicial system. I don't think that's healthy for anyone.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thank you very much to all three of you for your time this evening. Thank you to Arif Varani, Michael Barrett, and Daniel Blakey.
Thank you.
Why out of the 73 names was just one apparently selected for removal from their job, investigation? Before charges were even laid, the Prime Minister himself twice speculated that Mr. Norman would be in court. Why that one name? And we want to hear from the Prime Minister. He can't travel and hide from question period forever. We'd also like to hear from Mr. Wernick, Mr. Butts, the same people we saw in the SNC-Lavalin affair. This actually predates it because it stems from the very first Cabinet committee meeting related to procurement, where, as the new government was transitioning in, they quickly tried to kill a $700 million contract. So there's a lot of questions on who asked the RCMP to investigate the one name.
The case against Vice-Admiral Mark Norman may be stayed, or the charges are stayed, but the questions about what happened continue. Questions about why documents were not made available earlier and why former Conservative cabinet ministers were never interviewed during the RCMP's investigation into the leak. So what needs to come next to get a clear picture of what really happened in this case? It's time for the Power Panel to weigh in. In Vancouver, former Conservative cabinet minister Stockwell Day. Journalist Jen Gerson is in Calgary. In Toronto, Tim Murphy, managing director of Macmillan Vantage, and next to him, former finance minister from Saskatchewan, Andrew Thompson, now chief of government relations for University of Toronto. Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
Hello.
Jen, I'm going to start with you. If there is ever to be a point at which Canadians do get a clear picture of what really happened, when is that, do you think, and what needs to happen for that to occur?
We're miles off from that. I mean, the first thing I think that needs to happen is that Mark Norman himself needs to do as he has expressed an interest in doing, and come forward and give a really extensive interview about what happened from his perspective here. He has said that he expects to tell his story in the coming days. I'm presuming he's lining up those types of interviews right now. I'm free if he's interested. But no, I mean that is the next step of what I expect to see happen here. We'll see if any kind of allegations come out of those types of interviews or public media requests. The thing that interests me in all this is that his lawyer Marie Heinen implied very strongly that the decision to prosecute him in the first place was politically motivated. That I think is a very serious allegation or insinuation. She didn't directly allege it. She was too crafty for that, but an insinuation, and I think it's worth following up on. But first, let's hear what Mark Norman himself has to say.
And she kind of walked that back, Andrew, yesterday in a way. She did, she said that the decision to withdraw shows that the system is working, that there was no political interference. The DPP and the lead prosecutor have insisted there was no interference when it comes to laying the charge or staying the charge. Do you think Canadians are convinced?
Well, there's two reasons to stop a prosecution, right? Because you can't, either they don't believe they can get a conviction or they don't believe it's in the public interest. To date, they've not explained which of those two arguments they're pursuing or what the reason is for either of those. And I do think Canadians want a bit more of an explanation to that. This has been a prosecution that has certainly sullied the reputation of a high-ranking member of the Defence Forces. It's probably ruined his career. It's certainly had a terrible effect on him. And has called into question a number of other important issues, including the rule of law and the issue about just how Canada's military procurement system works. There's a lot of pieces to unpack here. I think at the end, the two that will be more enduring are actually going to be the sense of kind of cruelty that was used here against him as an individual, and then the lingering question about why neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals seem to be able to figure out how we can actually procure new equipment for our defence forces.
Tim, when you talk about that idea, just the optics of it looking like they went after this guy, do you think that there is a certain amount of interest and a level of scrutiny that Canadians want put on that?
Well, I think we need to separate two things here. One of which is, I think actually every participant in the process has been very clear on both, the political side and on the public prosecution side, that this was a process conducted by the RCMP and by the Public Prosecution Service, free of political interference. So let's separate. Then,
well, they haven't been that clear.
Nothing's been
I think
proven
it's
on
been,
that.
They said it's unequivocal.
The director of public prosecutions themselves said there was no interference. The Crown Attorney and the particular Crown Prosecutor said there was no political interference.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
The government has said, and it's so I'm prepared to take, public officials at their word, apparently, unlike others. So, but let's separate. So let's put that aside. Are there circumstances where public officials like prosecution services, like the police, we might want to have an explanation as to the decision-making they use? I think that might be appropriate. It's not very common in our system to ask the police or the Crown to explain their decisions. It is, the people who are caught up in that system, it's a very difficult and powerful system when the whole force of the police force and the prosecution service is aligned against them. But let's be clear, that's who it was. It was not politicians, it was not politics. This started with a procurement undertaken on a sole source basis by the Conservative government of the day. The new government came in and said, geez, maybe we want to take a look at that.
There are questions as to why there are genuine questions about why they they wanted to push the pause.
But why wouldn't you? It's a sole source contract, and then they nonetheless proceeded. So that's a set of issues in which I think it's, and by the way, the thing got procured. And so that, I think, is a legitimate, at least, question to have asked and to be answered. Obviously, there were some leaks. The RCMP conducted an investigation, made its own decision free from political interference. The Prosecution Service made a decision free from political interference. People might want an explanation of how those people made their decisions, but it's nothing to do with politics.
I take your point, and Stockwell, I'll just get you to jump in here, because I take your point that there are genuine questions for the RCMP and even for the prosecution service. But, Ms. Hennon made very specific allegations also about the nature of the political process. She said yesterday, the government has been she said there was no interference in the decision to stay the charge, political interference. But the government has been at the table. They've been at the table represented by 7 or 8 lawyers in court at the Justice Department. These charges were referred by the PCO. PCO has been the holder of the records that we've now spent 6 months trying to get. She also said that people in the PMO or PCO were counseling witnesses as to what they could and they could not say. She is the lawyer for the defense, but she made those allegations, and people might have questions about those too.
Don't forget the 60-page memo.
Yeah, Stockwell? Sorry, I'll just get Stockwell.
Well, it doesn't. I don't think it gets much more serious than this. She obviously, this is an accomplished lawyer, very proven, making serious allegations. She says, it's one thing if a judgment goes against you, but to quote her, she says it's another thing when somebody is putting their finger on the scale of justice and trying to tilt it. In terms of this not being political at all, the questions loom large here. You had documents that were being requested for months by the defense. When they finally came, not that many days ago, that seemed to speed up the decision for the case not to go ahead. And then when you get Andrew Leslie, Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary, saying, hey, by the way, I am going to testify on behalf of the Vice-Admiral, Vice-Admiral Norman. These are huge. You can't just say this isn't political. And the human tragedy here is for a military man or woman, there's nothing more serious than being charged with leaking documents about military activities. That's about as serious as it gets. Even, almost no matter what happens, I don't know how he gets his reputation back.
Well, interesting that somebody took a parting shot too, as well, right? They stayed the charges, but they said his actions didn't rise to a level of criminality, but were inappropriate.
Well, yeah, that's pretty weak defense. And let me toss one more thing into this. I've already heard, now I don't know if this will materialize, but some people suggesting that this is somehow going to come back upon a former minister also, Wilson Raybould, in terms of her being involved. Somebody's going to try and taint her in all of this because she was involved way back on the prosecution side. So this thing is getting very messy. Obviously, it's not going to be let go. They're doing a linkage with the SNC-Lavalin in terms of everybody saying, no, there was no prosecutorial interference, and then in fact it was. So this thing is not over. I really hope for Vice-Admiral Norman and his family that he can retrieve what is, up to this date, has been a sterling reputation.
The only thing on the political interference and trying to link it to SNC is either you think the DPP is, the great defender of independence, or that she was too easily swayed. You kind of can't have it both ways.
I think the question, though, is whether or not the political forces interfered in carrying out the justice in this case. I mean, by withholding the documents for as long as they did, is that the reason that there's no likelihood of a prosecution being successful, of there being a conviction? And I think there's a lot of questions around this. That said, I think this is quite different than SNC-Lavalin. I don't think this is going to have the same legs. I do think it's much more of a human tragedy and will have much more damage to the individual involved than, say, that of the politicians.
Jen, sorry, you wanted to jump
in.
What
about the 60-page memo that was totally redacted, that was written by Michael Wernick, the head of the PCO, and given to the Prime Minister's office, presumably about this case, and that we still haven't been able to read in full? I mean, the idea that there was no political interference whatsoever in the decision to prosecute Mark Norman strikes me as incredibly improbable. And an utterly outstanding question.
You mean the decision by the prosecution, sir? Wait a second, hold on. I just want to be clear. Are you saying
I'm glad that other people on this panel have such utter faith in people in government and believe that they can take them at their word. But to be perfectly blunt, that's not my job.
And you think the decision, though, to press the charges?
Completely without evidence.
Hold on, one moment. Let me just ask the question.
Sorry,
one moment, Jen. Are you trying to say that you think that the prosecution, when they decided to lay the charge, they were doing so because a politician told them to?
I think that there is that is the outstanding question that needs to be answered.
Well, they have said unequivocally that didn't happen.
And frankly, I don't think about people saying that didn't happen is good enough evidence that it didn't happen.
So what would be?
What other evidence is there but the people involved?
Well, there's
saying,
as I said, why would Michael
casual
be
casting of aspersions?
Hold on, let Jen finish, and then I'll give Tim. I'll give you the floor in a second.
Why would Michael Wernick be writing a 60-page memo that the public can't read to the Prime Minister's office about this case unless the Prime Minister's office were somewhere involved? How come Mark Norman was suspended from office apparently with no hearing, and then later tried without any kind of apparent internal process with D&D? How come it appears to be that, according to Ms. Heinen, that witnesses were potentially counseled and documents just suddenly disappeared? Like, I actually believe that the decision to rescind the charges probably was made without political interference. I think that seems plausible, and the timeline of that seems plausible. But the decision to go after him was an extraordinary one. It was a very political decision, whether or not you can prove that or not.
You don't actually understand how the charges decisions are made.
There are incredible outstanding questions about this case.
You
and
don't
to just say, well, these
Tim, I told you I'd give you the floor. One moment.
Yeah, you don't, literally that reveals a complete misunderstanding about how our justice system operates. The decision about whether or not to investigate is made by the police force, and whether to lay charges is made by police force in consultation with the Crown prosecutors, a decision they make without consulting with politicians, period, full stop.
After
then
SNC,
the process of this, including the decision related to...
Let him finish. Jen, you had the floor. Let Tim finish.
Including the decision as to whether or not to proceed was made by the Department of Public Prosecutions, again, as they themselves said, independent of political influence or lobbying. So I think it is completely outrageous. Like, who else are you going to believe but the people in charge of it, the actual director?
Do you actually
otherwise, you're going around and saying no one can be trusted in their public
service
of duty. It is appalling state of belief. And no wonder there's a mistrust in our whole government systems and systems
no wonder there's a mistrust in our
appalling.
whole government system. I wonder where that mistrust could possibly come from.
All right, we're going to take a breather. I think that there are genuine questions around the referral by the PCO and what motivated why just Mark Norman and maybe not other people, when we know that there were others alleged to have leaked. But like Tim said, the prosecutor, and I take your point, Jen, that there are questions around that given what's happened with SNC, but the prosecutor, the lead prosecutor, and the DPP were both unequivocal that there was no political interference in the decision to press or rescind the charge. And
sure. So as I said, let's answer those outstanding questions and put the case to rest.
Okay. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.